What's up, guys? Mr. Spitzer here, and today I wanted to talk to you about some of the supports we have for our fantasy writing unit. So, lesson one is all about collecting ideas for fantasy stories. Now, instead of giving you more resources and more supports, I wanted to explain to you the supports that we already have in place. So, hopefully, you've opened up lesson one, and I want to walk you through some of this. So, in fantasy lesson one, we are trying to generate ideas for a fantasy story. Now, if you're like me, this is kind of hard because you really don't know what to write about. There are so many possibilities of things in a made up fantasy world that you don't know where to get started. So, the first strategy that I want to talk to you about today is you just using a writer's notebook and thinking about common things that you find in your own lives that could be turned into a fantasy idea. So the example they give us is I wrote a list in my writer's notebook of things that I like to do, and that was their notebook entry. And their fantasy idea was that what if all of my favorite toys, games, and then people started disappearing gradually for no apparent reason? Now that sounds like an amazing fantasy story, but again, it's a little difficult to figure out how to come up with a great idea like this. So the first thing I want you to do in your writer's notebook is to think about how you're feeling at home right now, and some things that you're coming across in your daily life. So for me, during this quarantine, I'm feeling stuck. I want to really go out and go places, and I can't. So in my notebook entry, I said that I'm feeling stuck during quarantine. I've been brainstorming all the places I wish I could go. My fiance is looking up cabins to buy. So these are things that are occurring to me, are happening in my daily life, and I just made a notebook entry for it. So take a second, think about what's going on, how you're feeling in your daily life, and make a notebook entry. I'm waiting for you to do it. So after you've made your notebook entry, I want you to see how you can twist that idea or feeling and turn it into a fantasy story. So for me, I was feeling stuck at home because I couldn't leave my house. So I was like, what could I make, or what kind of story could I make where I could go anywhere I wanted to? And since I'm an ELA teacher, my idea was that what if I had a magical bookshelf that it could teleport me to any setting that I read about? So again, we're generating ideas based on things that are happening in our own lives. I was working on a fantasy story about my dog and him coming across a magic egg. So you're using things that are around you in real life and adding a little bit of magic to it or something related to fantasy. So our first teaching point, our strategy, using a writing notebook, using a notebook entry, and turning it into a fantasy idea. And then the next one is creating a quest. You notice that a lot of fantasy stories revolve around a character going on a mission or a quest. So for quest structure, they give you paragraph or sentence starters to outline a whole fantasy story. So you can see here on this left-hand side, we have the sentence starters. Somebody had to blank because blank, but this happened, so blah, 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 blah. However, and then eventually this happens. So if we use the example of the paper bag princess, now I don't know how many people are familiar with the paper bag princess. If you don't know this story, you can Google it or YouTube it and someone can read it to you. It's a really cute fantasy story. And in this story, I'm going to use this the structure, the quest structure, to describe how this paper bag princess story goes. So in this story, somebody had to save Prince Ronald from this fire-breathing dragon because the dragon stole the prince before Princess Elizabeth could marry him. So Princess Elizabeth is going on this quest, but she could not find any clothes or armor that were not burnt because the dragon burnt everything. So she wore a paper bag. So she went to the dragon and began to trick him and fool him into showing off in order to tire him out. However, when the dragon was finally asleep, Prince Ronald was rude and disrespectful to Elizabeth. He judged her for wearing a paper bag. So eventually, she left Ronald and they didn't get married after all. Again, I'm not writing some big elaborate story yet. This is just the planning phase. So I'm using these structures and sentence starters to come up with a general idea of what's going to happen in my story. When I go back to actually write my fantasy story, I'll add more details then. So instead of giving you another example, I wanted to explain what is happening at each part of your story. So somebody had to, that's like the end mission. That's what you hope they will accomplish. So in this case, someone had to save the prince. In your story, someone might have to return some lost item to some magical person. In The Lord of the Rings, the end mission is to take the ring and destroy it. And then with this because, you're explaining why they have to do that mission. In The Paper Bag Princess, she has to save the prince because she was going to marry him and he got taken away. In The Lord of the Rings, they had to destroy the ring because someone was trying to rule them all. So you're providing your reason why. But there's always going to be a problem or something that gets in the way of your character getting to the end result. So in this case, she couldn't just go and destroy the dragon right away because she only had a paper bag to wear. She didn't have armor or anything else. So you're thinking of a problem that gets in the way of your character completing their mission. Then you're going to describe the so is what your character does to avoid that problem. So in this case, she didn't have the tools to fight the dragon, so she had to trick him. However, usually when you're reading a fantasy story, the plan doesn't go exactly how it should, and I included that wording over here. So you have to explain why the plan doesn't go how it should. So in the case of our Paper Bag Princess, when she finally defeats the dragon, Prince Ronald is actually rude and she realizes she doesn't want to marry him because he judged her for wearing a paper bag. So your however section should just talk about why the plan doesn't go how it should, and eventually is how your story ends. You're going to wrap it up nicely because most fantasy stories are like a gift. They're wrapped up with a bow and your story is over. So this is the second strategy we talked about, is creating a quest for your character. Again, we're not writing this whole story yet. We're just creating general ideas or possible fantasy stories that we can elaborate on later. I hope this helped. If you have any questions, you can check in with myself or any of the other 6th grade ELA teachers for their office hours, and I hope to talk to you guys soon.